Yeah, we are recording in progress. So this is Patreon exclusive wine class on Australia, and it is April 29th. So I think you all know me, but my name is Laura Manick, and I'm very excited about this class. I had the great pleasure of going to Australia in 2013, and it was one of, I would say, the most magical, eye-opening, inspiring, demystifying wine experiences of my life. And I truly mean that. I mean, there's the great wine regions of the world, and we think about them and talk about them often at Cork Buzz and in our sommelier circles. And I think Australia gets a bad name. And, certainly what makes most wine regions famous can also be the wine, I guess you can say, burden of a region. So, when we thought for the first time about Australian wine as Americans, I think, some of us maybe first started drinking Australian wine because they were easy to recognize, affordable, fruity, juicy, jammy, and for all those reasons, there's a whole generation of people that were drinking Coca-Cola that are now drinking Yellowtail. And so I love that. I love that there is a drink, and that's how Australia would call it. There is a drink that was fruity and maybe had some residual sugar, and it had a critter on the label, and it introduced people to the idea that, that they made wine in Australia and that they could drink it. And we taught this masterclass after coming back from Australia. And one of my fellow, my mate, right? He is my friend. He works for Wine Australia. And he took us all around Australia, and he said it so perfectly. He was like, think about this idea. We cannot take a package that is, I guess a bottle of wine with the packaging, maybe 5 pounds, with everything, and ship it to Australia for the cost that they're selling, Yellowtail wine for. I mean, it's insane. Like, how can we ship a package of wine, from, a different part of the world, and for so inexpensive? So certainly they don't make a lot of money on it, but I found it fascinating. It's really true. So with that, critter labels became easy to drink. And there's a whole other world in Australia. As you can see from this great photo, this is a picture of Henschke's Hill of Grace vineyard. And we visited there. It's about an 8-hectare plot, and only 4 of the hectares are that go into Hill of Grace, and it's Shiraz that makes this wine. So this is a picture of Stephen Henschke. And it's just a really magical place, which I can talk about when we get into it in a little bit. But this is ungrafted vines in front of the old church, and these ungrafted vines have never, this area rather has never seen phylloxera. So this is one of my favorite memories, was visiting Henschke, having learned about Hill of Grace for so long, and getting out of the bus in what is Eden Valley, which is part of South Australia, you probably know, separated from Barossa. Totally different vista. Like when you visit Eden Valley, you see like these sparse vineyards all around. At any rate, we got out of the bus and they had like this solution in like a little foot bath, if you will. And everyone had to step their feet in this foot bath because they wanted to make sure, since we were traveling amongst the different states in Australia, that we were not bringing aphids or vine disease from another state, which I thought was just fascinating. Of course, you're going to do that if you have these, old vines that are just incredible as these are. So anyway, I broke out my old book. This is my green all-weather field book that I brought to Australia. And I want to reference it a few times because it's an entire book that I wrote notes on from being in Australia, which I thought it was so incredible too. Okay, so with that, let's continue. So we'll talk about the history and the background, what makes Australia special, and pepper in tons of stories, which is what we think is the most important about Patreon exclusive looks with me. Yes, of course, they're educational. You're going to learn bits, a lot of bits. But I think the real why do you love wine has to come through of, what is it like to be there? What are the people like? What does it feel like? What's really happening? Because you can read, all the great journalists that write books and encyclopedias about wine, but it feels different than you think. It really does. And every single state is completely different than the next. So there are main states of production in Australia. And I visited, we flew into Melbourne. So that's the state of Victoria. And I immediately got off the plane. And of course, these wine trips can be so fun, but they're also like, they're books full of wine visits. So we got off the plane and we went to this incredible wine bar. And it was called Jimmy Watson's Wine Bar. And it was in Melbourne and it was opened in 1933. So that was our first tasting. Literally, however long that flight was from New York City to Melbourne, and we stopped in LA, I believe. But anyway, so we immediately got there and we started tasting 35 different sweet wines, which is definitely a way to wake up after a long flight. So anyway, we'll talk about that. But Jimmy Watson was an Italian immigrant, and they said that Melbourne was the third largest Greek city in the world, which I thought was fascinating. And after the First World War, soldiers were given like blocks of land in Australia, especially in Melbourne, and the wine license didn't allow wine to be imported. So to get rid of the excess grapes, they could only grow their own and drink their own. So there weren't any like wine shops or groceries selling any imported wines. So anyway, so we'll talk about South Australia. South Australia is probably what we know the most. I think they say maybe 75% of the Australian wine in terms of bottles come from South Australia or from a blend of states because of these labels we were talking about in the very beginning. But South Australia feels more visually like you experience like this idea of like very dry, very arid, very like sort of what you think about as the great outback, right? Just like brush. Whereas Victoria doesn't feel like that. Victoria feels very green, as does New South Wales. And Western Australia, which I thought was probably my favorite of all the states, right by Perth, it feels like you're going to the Hamptons, like you fly into Perth. They call it Planet Perth. And they say that all the doctors in Perth would get these like homes in like these old pastoral estates. And so you see sheep and goat and like it just feels like you're going, on like a vacation, for the weekend, which is what they do. They weekend in Margaret River. But, like I said, they're all so different. South Australia, we know mostly Shiraz, but there's some incredible, and I'm talking incredible, old vines in South Australia. And that's one of the things we can talk about this old vine, commitment. And Victoria, we mostly, I guess, of the states, think of it like the cooler, not necessarily only cool in terms of like, it's fun, fashionable, but very like cooler climate. And, in different parts of Victoria, which we can talk about, like the Yarra Valley having Pinot Noir, the valleys run east-west. And so that's very similar to how you find the valleys in Santa Barbara, running east-west. And New South Wales, right, we went to Sydney, the proximity to being able to like have real authentic Asian food, in Australia in general, but in New South Wales, we really saw it in Sydney, like just incredible food. We were only in the major cities for a couple of, maybe like an evening or an afternoon because we're really whisked right off to the vineyards. But I found like some of the coolest wine bars in Sydney. They say like in Sydney, if it's not natural wine, people are not interested by it. So, that might be something. I don't necessarily agree it all has to be natural, but it was so fun to see like these, the Australian equivalent of like the wines that we see in New York, of like Jenny and Francois and like French glue wines. And it really was, there was some incredible food in Sydney, and but the wine scene is very, very like forward thinking, emerging, sort of natural scene. And what else can I say? Western Australia, I talked a little bit about, but Western Australia was the first intentionally planted, like non-immigrant, not a penal colony state. So like it wasn't really even, Margaret River wasn't even really planted until the early 70s. Whereas a lot of these other states, they have old vines going back to the 1800s. So there is a category called Langton's Exceptional, and it's sort of like the gold star, the extremely well-regarded, high-priced Australian wines, the like gold medal, if you will. And it's you'll see a lot of the wineries we're going to talk about today that have they're considered to be the Langton's Exceptional. And we're going to really focus on my travel and the regions, and we're going to go there via the wine icons, the wines we should know. So we're going to get our bearings one more time. You have the Pacific Ocean and the Bass Strait that separates, mainland Australia from Tasmania. I didn't talk about Tasmania on the main slide. I actually didn't visit there. But it's an incredibly beautiful place for sparkling wine. I mean, some of the best Aussie sparkling comes from Tasmania, and all full climate grapes, aromatic whites. We didn't really do any like Tassie tastings, but of course, through the studies of the master sommelier and just being in the wine business, Tasmania has some delicious sparkling wine, and subregions within Tasmania like Piper's River and Coal River. But let's say we can just imagine in general with Australia that all of the vineyards are in the south and along the coast of Australia. So we can understand why you wouldn't really see vines growing in Queensland or Northern Territory. Although I remember there was a question on the Masters that was like, what's the only winery in Queensland? And I can't even remember the answer, to be honest, because like no one's ever drank it. But for the most part, I see New South Wales on the eastern coast here near Sydney. And so these are all of our little wine regions, some, of course, literally on the coast, and then some that are further like up into inside. And so we can talk about the main ones, Hunter Valley being probably the most important. And Murray-Darling, we've seen a lot of those labels lately, but Hunter Valley Semillon, when you're thinking, we were talking earlier, not on the recording, but me and Venkat, about Hunter Valley Semillon. And, really there's a lot of rain in New South Wales. And so often they will harvest Semillon, the grape, earlier because they want to beat the rain. And so we really get these low alcohol, they call it in Australia, aperitif, like low alcohol apera style wines that can be really, really important in the world wine, because almost no one's making 11%. I think you said the label that you bought for today was 10.5% alcohol. I mean, no one's making wine like that, and certainly not what we think of in Australia. So that's really New South Wales. So we spent some time in Sydney, but we're not too much in actual New South Wales, except in Riverina, where there's a lot of flooding, and that can be a slight problem in certain vintages. Now, where we flew into and where I loved being in general was Melbourne. Melbourne has an amazing coffee scene, an amazing food culture, an incredible, rich, dynamic wine scene. The international grapes like Chardonnay and Pinot Noir thriving in the region, but also some really delicious Shiraz and, some dessert wine, like I was saying, the famous stickies, they call them. So in Victoria, you have Rutherglen Muscat, and that's what we did the tasting of. The Muscat makers of Rutherglen. There were 7 members, and they include producers like Campbell's is probably the one we know the most, and Chambers we also see a lot. And these 7 members made a classification system that was unique to them. That was it was self-regulated, if you will. And so we tasted Rutherglen Muscat and Topake, they call them, because a lot of the tawny words, like, the word tawny was already used by Portugal. So they had to come up with their own words for these things. But, it wasn't, I guess in phylloxera hit Victoria in right around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they said at that time, in all of Victoria, there was only 24 wineries. And, so before phylloxera, in the Rutherglen producers, now there's 7, but before phylloxera, there was 14 making these wines. So there was a shift from fortified wines during the Depression, shift to make fortified wines during the Depression in the 60s and 70s. But now, of course, there are fortified wines made in Rutherglen, but there's so many, especially by the coast over here, of really or dry, light table wines, like here, if you can see it right here in this little kind of corner of the strait, and it's number 61 is Victoria. But Yarra Valley, is Yarra Valley. But I fell in love with the Chardonnay from this region. I think if you're looking for the not Aussie Chardonnay, then Victoria is one of the best places. And I can tell you some of the producers that I fell in love with. But there's a region too, which is called 50, it's right here on the map, 52 Upper Goulburn, where they have a famous producer called Chateau Teblique. So a little bit further north. Heathcote, it's something that you'll see on labels. Yeah, so really fun. Skipping over to South Australia, we flew into Adelaide. Adelaide, totally different language. We were laughing because I was, of course, on a bus with for, I guess it was 16 days between all of the whole trip with, the same people. So we were making our Australian accents and wine jokes and things like that. And you really did feel like there was a different dialect in South Australia comparatively to Victoria, and that was in Adelaide. And I think the most famous region that we're going to spend some time talking about is Barossa, but really, who can't fall in love with McLaren Vale? McLaren Vale to me was the star of South Australia. It was old vine Grenache, and so if you know me well, you know that I love Grenache. And it's one of the few places where Grenache is grown on sand. Sand is probably the most important soil for Grenache in the world. It's where the sandy soils of Chateau Reyes and Châteauneuf-du-Pape, that's what makes, I think, Chateau Reyes Grenache so different than the rest of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, like Beaucastel producers with a Gallet Rouge. So to find that there are these ungrafted bush vines, really growing in this sandy soil in McLaren Vale was incredible. And then the same thing, it's McLaren Vale has a pizza scene, and we went to this place that's only open 1 day a week. I can't even imagine a business that can only open 1 day a week. And it was packed. I can probably find the name in my notes. And they only serve pizza and oysters. And the wine list was insane. I'll find my notes and I'll tell you the name of the place. But I remember by that day, it was barely 4 days in, and I was so jet lagged. And I went to the room to take a nap after flying from Melbourne and doing that sticky tasting all day and spending time in Victoria and Yarra Valley, and then flying to Adelaide and then visiting and tasting really big Barossa, Shiraz and Cab, and then being okay, we need home, going to sleep, and almost sleeping through the bus leaving the hotel to go to this this, pizza joint. And thank God I didn't, because it was like one of the best places. It just felt like every Australian winemaker in McLaren Vale was there, and they were sharing their wines, and there were young people, and everybody was eating pizza and grilling oysters, and that's McLaren Vale. That's what's special. So yes, the other thing that I felt was really fun about South Australia was going up, it's not far from Barossa, but going to Eden Valley, where we started our slide with Henschke, and seeing that, like I mentioned, South Australia could be perceived as like this sort of, brushy, great outback type place. But within that, there's the Adelaide Hills, when you drive up into the mountains, and they feel totally different. They feel like you're in like this forest, of like really green places. And it's just like, I don't know, it's so magical. So anyway, that's South Australia. And then way on the Southern Ocean, in Perth, on the Indian Ocean side, you kind of bordering Southern Ocean on the southern tip, and then Indian Ocean is on Perth, as I was kind of jokingly saying. But Margaret River, one of the best places in the world, great wine scene. Also, a very big community of growers that are sharing ideas, and Cabernet. It's all about Cabernet in Margaret River. Yes, there's beautiful Chardonnay, and the first vines, I think, were planted Malbec, but then ripped up. But really, the Cabernet Sauvignon, because it is one of the few places, along with Bordeaux, that has deep gravel beds, and Cabernet does not like to have its feet wet. If its feet are wet, said an Australian to me, that's when you get that real like green herbal thing, the pyrazine, as we know. And so gravel, of course, known for the left bank of Bordeaux with Pauillac and Saint Estèphe and such. Yeah, intentionally planted when they found there was all these gravel outposts in Margaret River. And so we walked into a tasting of Margaret River Cab with every single grower in Margaret River, and got to taste them side by side. And the other interesting thing that I must say that you can't really read in books about Margaret River is that the smell of eucalyptus is everywhere. I mean, yes, you see eucalyptus trees all over Australia in the southern parts, but really like everywhere in Margaret River. Like you almost feel like you walk out of your hotel room and you smell eucalyptus oil. And so that's really cool. Okay. We'll continue. History of wine. In the 1780s, vines arrived with the fleets of prisoners from Britain. The first vine was planted in Sydney's Botanical Garden, or where it is now Sydney's Botanical Garden. In 1820s, there was domestic sale of wine. This, I guess you can call him famous, James Busby brought cuttings, like sort of, it was like almost like the Augustine Herazi of Australia, bringing cuttings, suitcase cuttings of vines from Spain and from France that were pre-phylloxera, and established some of the real old vines of Australia's core, heritage vineyards. In the mid 1800s, there was a lot of vines planted. Wine production was booming, and some of the best brands, the biggest, that at that time were not considered like big as they are now, were established and launched at that time. I mentioned in the late 1800s, phylloxera struck Victoria and South Australia, and it was devastating. And then just like it kind of followed in the US, when we got phylloxera in Napa, there's a lot that happened between phylloxera hitting, the vines, sort of dying, the replanting, and then World War, and then the Depression. And for us, it was, of course, Prohibition. But so early 1900s, fortified dessert wine, big, juicy, kind of sweet styles that wouldn't spoil. That was all the rage. And that lack of export market, where you couldn't import wines from other you couldn't import wines from Europe to Australia. They started exporting wine to the UK. And so Australia exported more wine to the UK than France did. So there was a taste for Australian wine and still remains in England. In the late 1900s, we saw the rise of technology. And that's probably what most people think of when they think of Australian wine. They think of modern winemaking. They think of extraction. They think of big, bold, fruity, over-oaked wines. And actually, this is a great line. I think it was this gentleman named, let me see, what was his name? Steve Flamsteed. He owns a winery called Giant Steps, and they make a wine called Innocent Bystander. Very cool. They own a restaurant, a bakery. Anyway, it was in Victoria. And he said, like, anyone can like get grapes ripe, you know, like anyone can leave grapes on a vine and get them ripe. Anyone can over oak a wine, but it, you know, it takes real skill to clearly like have restraint. And that's the style of wine that they make for Australians. They're like, we make these over oaked, juicy, fruity wines for Americans because that's what you people drink. And we were just laughing because it's like, yeah, chicken or the egg. Like, are you making wines for us, or are those the style of wines that we associate with Australia? So I found that was pretty cool. So 1900s, we have something called the Label Integrity Program. It's similar, but not regulated the same way as like the AOP system, where, you know, you have to be integrous, right, about what you put on a label. And so just like the AVAs regulated by like the TTB and the BATF, this is similar in the Label Integrity Program introduced in the 1990s. And 1996, we start to have what we call GIs. And the GIs are geographical indicators, basically AVAs, where we're saying, okay, the smallest is a GI, and it's within a zone or a region, which is within a state. So 2000s export total over 600 million liters of wine, the fourth overall in the world. They had the goal, by the way, the Australians had the goal of being, you know, like they're in the top 10 producers or export markets in the world for 2050, and they exceeded that by 2000. So they had like ambitious goals, and they like blew those goals out of the water. To me, the reason is because they got approachable, young, value wines. When you start a consumer with something like that, they become region loyal. So, you know, the screw top, very important. I think probably 9 out of 10 wines in Australia and New Zealand are made under screw top, or Stelvin closures, as they're so lovingly called. Even Henschke, they switched their top wines, their top cuvées, their old vine, 1800 vine, you know, Henschke Hill of Grace makes only 4 hectares of Shiraz to screw tops. And while we're on the subject of Stelvin closures, I can tell you that I was a part of a tasting when we first opened Cork Buzz, where Chateau Margaux, you know, they make that second label, and they did a tasting at Cork Buzz, where they had all the journalists come, and they were doing Pavillon Rouge, their second label. For a moment, I was drawing a blank. By the way, if you ever forget something in wine, know that there's so much info in your brain. So sometimes when you're like, wait, I'm telling a story and I can't remember the name, and then it's like, just wait for it, it'll come. So yeah, Pavillon Rouge, they were doing a tasting with journalists, and they had bottlings of Pavillon Rouge under screw top and bottlings under cork. And we served them, we were the host for the winery, we served them to the journalists side by side. And well, first of all, no one could tell the difference, except, of course, that the ones under screw top tasted younger, even though they were the same vintage. So at that time, I don't know, it's probably 2014, because we opened in 2011. So it was like 3 years after we opened. And I think they were serving like, you know, the 2000 vintage, but they were doing these case studies. And so with the innovation that we have now with screw tops, they're able to give a little seal in the inside of the screw top where they used to not be able to, which allows oxygen exchange. And so since the Stelvins are getting better, some of the higher end wines in Australia are going to be bottled under screw top. So that's pretty cool. Okay, back to Australian regulations. As we mentioned, Wine Australia, a really great organization, one of the best if you're looking for trade organizations. They have an incredible resource, incredible website. Wine Australia regulates the wine industries. They help set the regional boundaries. They set, labeling, help with the trade commissions. They have great educators. And so if you're ever wanting to visit Australia and you need to reach out to an organization, I think that they're amongst the best trade organization. So do reach out, and if you obviously need help, I can share some of my notes. So they control the governing body and regulations of wine. And then the label integrity program in 1990 follows that of Europe. Basically, it's easy to remember. If you label by grape, by year, by region, 85% of the stated grape, year, or region must be what you put in the label, put in the bottle. So a little bit more strict than the United States, which we probably know, stated grape, if you remember, 75%. So it's really just so that they don't have to make two different wines for Europe, because Europe has that 85% rule for grape, year, and region. So they're just following that. GIs are regions listed in the register that are protected names, and they're based on geography only. There is no regulations about you can or you can't grow this or that in a GI, which let's think of them like AOPs or DOs or DOCGs. So these little regions within zones, no regulation in terms of yield, grape, aging requirements, minimal alcohol, none of that. So very similar to the rest of the New World. However, regions are become known for things. We know Clare Valley Riesling, we know Eden Valley Riesling, we know, the great red soils of Coonawarra and how great Cabernet can be, and we know Hunter Valley is for Semillon. So there's they're not official, but there are definitely regions associated with grapes like Margaret River and Cab, and Barossa and Shiraz, and McLaren Bell and Grenache, and you name it. So we have the states, which we spoke about, Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. And then within the states, we have our zone. So we'll have like a region, like a big zone that might have multiple GIs across it, but it's a bigger, more popular region or zone. So we have like things like the limestone coast, where all of the soils are, heavily based in limestone, and that's a zone. And then within the limestone coast, we have our region or GIs, sub-regions within regions. So this is the best example that we could think of. It's like South Australia state zone is Barossa, although there is a region that is Barossa Valley, so not to be confused with the Barossa zone. And then the region within Barossa is actually Eden Valley, so it's a sub-region of Barossa. And then there's a section that's based on elevation called High Eden Valley. Okay. Also, I found really cool in Eden Valley, there was some delicious, I wasn't expecting this. We went to this really great, little winery. There was Sauvignon, a lot of Sauvignon and some Trousseau, and I'll find the name of it. I'm so excited. I'm gonna because when I dug this out to create the presentation and I started reading my book, I was like, there's so much information here. I'm so glad I never throw my wine books away. I mean, just for visits, there's just like, where should you go in Melbourne, and anyway, so I don't have time to share everything, but I'll try to pepper in some stories as we go. Okay, so South Australia, founded by an English merchant in the 1836. The earliest records of vines being planted were 1842. And it was mostly Salesian farmers and tradesmen, although there's different parts. You'll see a lot of German settlers in Eden Valley, like a lot of Lutheran German. They were saying that In Eden Valley, the first language, like a lot of times they taught school children, was German. And so that's pretty cool. But anyway, the late 1800s, they're emulating the style of wine from Europe. There's Penfolds, of course, which we'll talk about in great detail. And they're making wines like Grange, Penfolds Grange, modeled after Max Schubert's secret project called, Hermitage, like modeled after like the great, Rhone Valley wines. Yearing Station with their award-winning wines. So South Australia produces, like I mentioned, I think 75% of Australian wine, 25% coming from Barossa. So just to get your bearings, we did not go to Kangaroo Island. Apparently it's a lot of kangaroos, but we did not go. So you're in Adelaide, you have the Gulf St. Vincent, just all the way north. We didn't visit, but Clare Valley. So a great property in Clare Valley called Pusey Vale. If you haven't had it, we use that a lot. Pusey Vale makes a delicious Riesling grown on granite called Contours, which it ages so incredibly well. But anyway, Clare Valley Riesling, really different than a lot of the other Rieslings that you might find in the world. But Adelaide on the Gulf of St. Vincent, we have Adelaide Plains, Barossa a little further inland as a sub-region of the Barossa zone. You have Eden Valley, Adelaide Hills, very, very fun. McLaren Vale, Southern Fleurieu, Currency Creek and Langhorne Creek. And then if you go further inland, you have Riverland, which is like really like marshy. For a while, there was no, it would get like flooded, and there would be very hard to be reliable viticulture there. So they have some of those grapes like Muller Turgau and like grapes that are like just like so resistant to every single thing. There's a lot of like fungal disease in Riverland, but there's some cool things happening there too when it's not being flooded. So then just far south, you have Coonawarra, known for its terra rosa soils, those red clay-based soils. Pathaway and Rattenbury, Mount Benson, and Robe. So we'll probably focus most of our time with McLaren Vale, Adelaide Hills, Barossa, and Eden. And in 1951 is when Max Schubert started making Penfolds Grange. There was a period of time where they told him not to make it anymore. And so there were these secret vintages, which we'll discuss, I think from like 53 to 59, where like he was told to stop making it, but he still made it. And those are like the most collected wines in the world. Old Penfolds Grange really is incredible. It tastes a lot if you like the wines of Vega Sicilia. They're very similar, which is odd because it's not Spanish, but the connection I think for me is old American oak with big, bold fruit. So I've had a lot of old Penfolds Grange, luckily, and they're really rustic and big at the same time, like sort of like inky and mineral. I'm a big fan of Henschke. I love the property, I love the people, I love the wines. So in 1952, we had Mount Edelstone, which we'll talk about, and 1960s change towards table wines from those fortified dessert wines we were talking about. But there was a grape surplus, too much wine. So in the 80s, they had something called the vine pulling scheme, where they were paying people to pull up vines. And then in the 1990s, probably most influential wine critic in the world, Robert Parker, making a lot of these properties 100-point wines, because let's be honest, they have no problem with the sunshine and ripening grapes. So, that really put South Australia specifically on the map for big international recognition, and well-deserved in so many cases. So not as much in the 2000s for demand and change in global market, a return to less is more. So South Australia, it's not suffering. I mean, it's still producing, 75% of Australians' wine, but maybe not as crazy as it used to be. So, all right, let's talk about Penfolds. So Penfolds was founded in Adelaide in 1844 by Christoph Penfold, an English doctor who emigrated to Australia and his wife. And they were, this is to me the most impressive, like so young, 33, 24. They were supported, they bought by family, and they were gifted 200 hectares at the foot of Mount Lofty Ranges. So basically, where are we here? They're like right in here, these Mount Lofty Ranges. If you're on the border of like Eden and Barossa, that's what separates Eden from Barossa. So initially they produced fortified wines like sherry, for like doctor for drinks, for like, you know, healing the sick, if you will. And then they started discovering this idea of dry wines, of Riesling and Claret style Cabernet based wines, and really found them easy to produce in such a beautiful warm climate. At the age of 68, so basically from 24 to 68, still making wine, they owned about a third of the South Australian wine stores, and they started exporting wine to the UK in greater amounts. 1903, Penfolds is the largest winery in Adelaide, and you know, currently it got bought, and it's part of the large Treasury Wine Estates, but it's definitely one amongst the oldest and really the most well-known. I mean, this is an icon. If you haven't heard of it, like, how can you make wines that are $4 and also make wines that are $400? I mean, it takes real know-how. The chief winemaker since 2002 is Peter Gago, is very famous, very charismatic, incredible winemaker. But they changed their focus. We talked about that, and let's talk about Grange. This is one of those, you know, gold standard icon wines, Australia. Grange Hermitage, you know, post-war Australia, right, back with groundbreaking science, they started thinking about how to avoid flaws in wine. But it was Max Schubert, the winemaker at the time, that really put, you know, this wine on the global scene of collectible wines. He went to Europe after World War II. He was trying to figure out fortified wines, and so he was going to Shiraz and sherry, and then just like randomly took a trip in the, you know, 49 post-war to Bordeaux, and really came back with this incredible passion and started making Grange as we know it in 1951. And it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't well received. They told Max to stop making it. And from 57 to 59, they made it in secret. And today it's one of the most celebrated wines in the world. So Shiraz, what does it taste like? Peppery and intense, and bacon and lavender and eucalyptus. But it's really amongst like the wines where you taste it and you know you're not just tasting Aussie Shiraz, but you're tasting Penfolds Grange. It's like one of those wines, you know. And then they make another wine, which is, I love. I think it's, you know, a wine that we should all know. It's Bin 707 Cab. It's also a premium wine. The first release was in the mid 60s. It's named after the Boeing 707, not after a bin. Best Cabernet, old vines, picked, hand harvested, partial barrel fermentation. You know, that's probably what, I mean, it's still a premium wine, but it's definitely one of the wines that is another icon of Penfolds. So let me see. I'm trying to see what else I want to tell you about Adelaide, South Australia. Like I said, you know, it did feel most of South Australia felt, like I said, a little bit dry and more arid. But when you go to McLaren Vale, you'll see it's pastoral. It's green, it's dry. There's olive groves everywhere. You know, a lot of Italian settlers in McLaren Vale. And let's see. South Australia, 14 different soil types. There's a lot of, like I said already, old vines. Some of the fun things that I tried there, Chenin Blanc from South Australia, especially from McLaren Vale, that was cool. We saw a lot of Sangiovese being Italian, some Fiano. I was not expecting in McLaren Vale to find like, and that wine bar I told you that I suddenly found myself in after I almost slept. Sagrantino, near to Avola, really just fun playing around with Southern Italian, mostly grape types. There's some Nebbiolo too. But like we had in a wine bar, 2002 Chenin Blanc from McLaren Vale. That was insane. So incredibly fresh. They have a lot of good storage in wine bars, wine cellars. Like they can sell wine in wine bars and to go and also for consumption. And so I'll find that name of that actual pizzeria in a minute. But back to Barossa, you have the Barossa Valley proper within the zone of Barossa and the most important of the fine wine regions. And we almost got bit by a very dangerous snake while we were in Barossa Valley. They're literally like everywhere. It's hot. It is really hot. You know, they say like it's like 3 degrees Celsius hotter in Barossa than it is in Eden Valley, which you can see is like just adjacent. But in Eden Valley, it's a lot of hillsides. And so let me tell you, higher altitude, which is what makes it important, but Eden Valley has a challenge with water. And especially like if you go to Henschke, that's one of the things, there's a lot of salinity in the water. Like, so if you use the water for like irrigation, it can cause a lot of problems in the winemaking. So they don't really do that. And that's the challenge in Eden Valley. It's the water rights and the water tables. And so when we talk about Henschke a little in greater detail, I'll explain. But yeah, I mean, it can be a big problem for the farmers. Okay. Riesling, Shiraz, Eden Valley, like I said, a lot of German speaking. That makes sense. Bringing the Lutheran settlements in Eden Valley, bringing some of the German grapes like Riesling and the subregion of High Eden. Australia is known for its minty, deep, dark fruit. People say thick style, concentrated. I mentioned there's definitely wines not being made in this style, but there are a lot of still those wines that can be really, really good. 100 hectares of century-old vine. So this was the tasting that we did, where we were with the Barossa Old Vine Charter. It was a group of growers that started it, established in 2009, and they created this regulatory, like basically like a collaboration of growers that regulate old vines. And so in order to use the name Old Vine on your label, the grape must be 35 years old minimum and fully mature and have thick trunks, and show development in wine where you're starting to get higher concentration. You will sometimes see the term survivor vines, where it's basically double, and they show much, much lower yields and higher concentration in the wine. And, you know, they get more intense, as you can imagine, with older vines. And then the centenarian vines, which are 100-year-old vines. So there's 100 hectares of century-old vines in Barossa. It was incredible to do this tasting. I'm going to find some of my notes, you know, just to read some of these wines. But I mean, just think about like just the most intensely minty, thick wines. And, you know, I say that because like it doesn't seem like I would like, right? I mean, you're a sommelier, you're not supposed to like big, juicy wines like that. But, you know, some of my notes are like, they're not too oaky. They wear the oak so well. They're like dried, dehydrated blueberry skin. Like there was 3 acres planted of this one wine, and it tasted like the mint and the combination of the eucalyptus and the mint with the old vines really make like this like dynamic, like herbal. It sounds bad to say like it's like an herbal medicine, but it was just so good. And you just need little sips. And ancestor vine, if you see that 125-year-old pre-phylloxera, that's the distinction between centenarian vines. They must be pre-phylloxera, and they've been around since the first settlers, those vines.
low yielding. They have less canopy, so they can have sometimes scorched flavors because the canopy also is reduced. The tannins are riper. They're physiologically riper earlier, and they're softer in the old vines. And the pH, they say that the old vines have higher pH, so lower acid, and yeah, and sometimes it's not because it has to do with the vine and their ability to extract from the soil. So they have slightly lower acid, but because they're so concentrated, it's not like it's flat or flabby. And that's the kind of breakdown of the different grapes that make up. You'll get this presentation after. Let's go to Henschke. That was the visit I was so excited about. I don't know if I was saying when the recording happened, I think I did, that we got out of the van and washed our feet in solutions to make sure we weren't transporting any aphids from other states to this really beautiful property. So Henschke Hill of Grace, it's technically the Barossa Valley floor. It's on the opposite side of the Barossa Valley floor that you find Eden Valley, and it's 450 meters above sea level. Eden vineyards are really sparse. They're situated like in like these underground places where they can sort of extract water. I was mentioning there was saline or salt in the water, and that caused a real problem for more wineries. Like if there wasn't a water issue, there would be much more access and vineyards. But South Australia didn't have convict settlements. It was a Lutheran congregation. George Pfeiffer paid for the passage of this community to this area. But the main water supply is the River Murray. So you can see the River Murray here. Let's see. So Adelaide is about 56 kilometers south. I told you already, they teach German in the local schools, or they did initially. They have their own dialect. Let's see, Johann Henschke founded the property in 1841 with his wife and 4 children. 2 of the children died, and so did the wife. And then James Busby brought varietals from Europe. In 1952, they stopped making their fortified wines, which was what they really were known for in the beginning, and started making table wines. Currently, it's 5th generation, and I showed you a slide of Stephen, such a gentleman, and his wife Prue, who is a viticulturist, who walked us through the vineyards, and they're just a wealth of knowledge. And so in 1868, there was a commercial winery. They won a competition, and they won my video died, or timed out. Sorry. They in 1868, they won this competition that they were able to supply all the church with wine for sacrament. And they still do. The local church that you saw in the photo of the Hill of Grace, in Mount Edelstone, that photo. So right now, they're experimenting with biodynamic viticulture, and Prue is making her own compost, and really is one of the leaders in biodynamic movement in a big winery. Dry farming, as the water is the issue. A lot of the farming is done in dry farming, and helps with the concentration. The vines are 2 different types of vines in Henschke, which I love seeing. They have the traditional VSP in some of the vineyards, but then they have their grandfather's vineyard, which is old vine, what they call Australian sparl. So like those sort of bush vine without the trellising lines. And so you see both in the Henschke property. And where we're at. Oops. I hate technology sometimes. It wants to time out when you're talking too much. I guess it's a way of telling you to stop talking so much. Okay, Hill of Grace, the Shiraz, Australia's most famous single vineyard. So because technically Grange is not a single vineyard, it's a label, right? It's a blend of multiple vineyards, and they didn't intend to make Grange as a single vineyard. And also one of those gold standard Langton's Exceptional. The inaugural vintage 1958 coincided with the 100-year anniversary of the church that you saw. That is a stone building that makes the Hill of Grace Vineyard. And what else? 4 hectares I mentioned of Shiraz ungrafted. There are 8 hectares in the vineyard, but 4 hectares are ungrafted, grown on their own original rootstock. Tons of different soils, but mostly sandy clay with gravel outposts. Now harvested with the full moon of Easter. And aged in both French and American oak. So an important distinction, because a lot of times we think about just American oak, but they use both. And since 2002, I think I mentioned this before, they are labeling or they're bottling under screw top. Okay. Mount Edelstone Shiraz is another cuvee that they make. This was the Centenarian vine, so 100-year-old vines. And yeah, I mean, I actually think that sometimes it's equal, if not better, to some of the Henschke Hill of Grace wines that I've had. So same things, only using screw top in the winery since 2002, and it's delicious. Another really amazing winery that I found when I was there, well, I didn't find it, I knew about it, but that I fell in love with is Yalumba. Yalumba is also in Eden Valley, and the winemaker is just brilliant, Louisa Rose. She's amongst my favorite female winemakers, not just in Australia, but in the world. Incredible love of Southeast France grapes. Yeah, of course, Shiraz and Grenache, but makes delicious Viognier, some of the best Viognier I've had. And yeah, so I think she's a really important winemaker to know, but also their Tricentenary Grenache, also one of my favorite wines, with not necessarily sandy soils, but old gnarly bush vines that can be so delicious. I'm not going to talk about every single producer, obviously, but I do want to talk about Torbreck. They became one of the younger, new generation, but now since 1994, celebrated wines. I remember when I was working in Las Vegas in 2004, I guess, they were like a newcomer that everyone loved. At that time, maybe less is more. Oh, they were one of the first to do like less is more style of winemaking, and now maybe they're a little bit more modern. But really beautiful pepper, if you want to see what like real strong like pepper and bacon and minty eucalyptus at once. I love the Torbreck Run Rig. So I'm gonna skip some of this stuff because I have to make sure I'm setting us up on time. Barossa Old Vines. You're going to get these slides with all these producer names like Elderton Commands. That was a really nice property that I visited. And we'll kind of skip around. Barossa, we talked about Semillon, Chardonnay, or sorry, not Semillon, but Chardonnay and Riesling. Clare Valley, I mentioned it a little bit, but we have Contours Riesling coming from Pusey Vale that I quite like here. One of my favorite things when we were in Australia and when we got to Adelaide, we were in Adelaide Plains and Adelaide Hills, and we had a dinner of like, we were drinking, and I think of this with Clare Valley too, Riesling with lime and oysters. So like one of my markers for Clare Valley Riesling is always like a lime, like those little like little limes. I forget the name of them, but they have like almost like a sweetness, like a Meyer lemon would, but the equivalent of a lime. And when we got there, they served like raw oysters on the half shell with like I want to say squoze and lime, lime squeezed on top of the oysters, and I'll never forget it. It was like, oh, they're local oysters from Gulf St. Vincent with Clare Valley Riesling with age. Ooh, so good. And actually in Clare Valley, this is something that I teach about when blind tasting. Petrol is showing the TDN or the compound that you get when you smell that petrichor. You get like that minerality, we sometimes say, and the diesel. It happens much earlier in Australian Riesling than it does in Riesling from Germany, meaning younger wines will show petrol even quicker in warmer climates. So this climate's, as you might imagine, continental, away from the the Gulf St. Vincent and the Southern Ocean. So a little bit further inland, warmer, slightly warmer, more continental. And the hotter the climate, the more you get that TDN or that petrol younger. And also when you have old vines, it shows petrol sooner. And when you have gravel soils, which they do, or high elevation, which they do in Clare Valley, all of these things add on to feeling and finding the petrol earlier than you would, like if you were comparing apples to apples in Mosel or Rheingau and same vintage. So that's like something just to keep in mind. A lot of times people think about Riesling, they're like, oh, I didn't get petrol, therefore it's not Riesling. Sometimes you could be tricked because you don't get petrol just because it's Riesling. You get it in concentration as Riesling ages, or if the climate is conducive to it. So you'll find it in Rheingau German Rieslings sooner than you will in Mosel or cooler subsections of Germany. Dreamy Adelaide Hills. There is a subregion of Adelaide Hills called Piccadilly and Lenswood. And I'm telling you, those two places felt like they were in like a forest nymph. Like it was just like so magical. Like you drive up in elevation to the Adelaide Hills and you get to these little like mountainous regions, mountainous vineyards, and they're just so different. Like I said, I mean, when you fly into Adelaide, it feels dry and sort of dusty and Australian. But when you start to see these little sub-regions and realize they're so different, it's pretty cool. So my favorite were the Chardonnays from Adelaide Hills. Love those. They really had a lot of Merceau-like qualities, lower alcohol. They use a clone in a lot of the Chardonnay in Australia. It's a clone called Gin. It's also called Mendoza clone. It's a little smaller clone where, especially in Adelaide Hills, it has Miller Andage, which is called like hens and chicks, where the little berries and the big berries exist in the same clone. And so what's cool about that is you get like some riper fruit and some sour fruit, which is, I think, more dynamic and gives you like not just tropical big Chardonnay, but like the juxtaposition of the two, which is quite lovely. Okay. We do need to talk about Wendouree, very, very famous in Clare Valley. Current owners, Tona and Lita Brady, they purchased this estate in '74. They kept the original winery. It's over 100 years old and never changed. It's like something similar to like the Mayacamas estate in Napa, where it's like, very few very few owners, very traditional, older. I think now it is imported to the United States. I think when we made this slide, it wasn't, just recently, I believe. But the Wendouree estate wines really are just so surprising. You can have old vine Shiraz, Cabernet, sometimes mixed together. They say like almost like Margot, like in style, like Iron Fist, Velvet Glove, similar description that they use from Margot. We've had some older, when we were in Australia, we found a wine cellar in McLarenville, actually, that same one that had Wendouree back to like the 80s. And they're really special wines. And so the Wendouree Shiraz, you can see very traditional label. Again, one of those gold label, aged in stainless steel, and then 20% in seasoned American oak for 12 months. And they have some good Shiraz Malbec blends and single vineyard Shiraz that are just mind-blowing. Clare Valley, not as like jammy, more along the lines of like the Rhone Valley, but not like Hermitage, more like probably Côte Rôtie style. I think sometimes there's a little bit of Viognier, a touch of Viognier sometimes added to the old vine Shiraz from them, where you get that little aromatic lift of sort of, you feel like you're having a more floral version, like the more lavender in the Shiraz. So that's pretty fun. Also, I thought it was important to talk about Grosset because we don't really see these wines. So you were talking all about Pusey Vale, but this is a really nice Riesling that I actually haven't had in a long time, but we drank a lot of it when we were in Australia. And if you find it, definitely buy it. It's so delicious. And, you know, we don't often talk about those celebratory Australian Rieslings. So going back to Victoria, where we kind of started, at least in my trip, we started the smallest and the coolest state besides Tasmania. We're not going to really talk too much about Tasmania because of time and because I didn't visit. But you have a maritime influence, the high humidity, lots of winter rain, which is good because it happens in the winter. But I mentioned you find Yarra Valley is Pinot Noir and Chardonnay kind of land, if you will. And Yarra is the oldest of all the wine regions. There's a lot of gray, sandy, loamy, red basalt type soils. And the valley runs east-west. And exciting, like the Pinot Noir, I would say maybe has some of the spice that you find in Pinot Noir from Russian River, but definitely not the weight. It's actually lighter in style, maybe the weight of, you know, Willamette Valley. Some of my favorites include like Mac Forbes is the really dynamic winemaker in Yarra. When we visited, we had some really cool, I'm trying to find one of the favorites of the group when we were in Yarra. That was like one of our first trips. And sometimes when you have Yarra Shiraz, I wrote here like Cluzel Roche, it tastes like Côte Rôtie, so amazing. So 45 kilometers away from Port Phillip Bay, you have the cool ocean around Yarra, warmer ocean around Adelaide, long fall. What else did I write? 1850s, the first plantings, mostly Bordeaux grapes, believe it or not, on the eastern side. And then Pinot Noir was, you know, not originally planted. Pinot Noir likes moisture, so it does well there. And yeah, our favorites, Yarra Yearing, one of the oldest. Oak Ridge was really cool to see while we were there. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times we know about Pinot Noir there, but my notes have a lot of high points, like nice tasting notes from like the local Shiraz. A lot of whole cluster fermentations with Shiraz that gives, you know, the same, similar to the Rhone Valley. And then Mount Mary, this was a favorite. We found old vintages. That's the cool thing. There's a lot of old cellars in Australia at like the wine shops. When you go, you'll find vintages that clearly you'll never find in the States. And so we found some Mount Mary, which is their most celebrated wine. So 3 generations, north-facing vineyards of Cabernet, Merlot, Cab Franc. This drinks like Bordeaux. Really, really, truly drinks like Bordeaux. I think we had a bottle not too long ago, a bunch of sommeliers, and everybody was like, "Oh, Cheval Blanc, it tastes like, you know, it could be Haut-Brion," and it was like an old Mount Mary vineyard. So definitely seek those out. I guess this was one of my MS questions, which is why I kept it in here. Tablique was the oldest winery in Victoria, located on the Nangambie Lakes. We used to have this at Cork Buzz when we first opened, old Marsanne made from Tablique. So kind of drinks like white Hermitage, you know, Hermitage Blanc, or, you know, like that kind of like waxy golden, along the lines of like the icons of like Chateau Moussard, or, Lopez de Heredia Blanc. So if you see Tablique, definitely Marsan, Old Vine Marsan, buy it. It's very fun. And then this was so rare, but we did find a bottle of Best's Meunier, and we had this for a while at Cork Buzz too. They are making like really, really small production pre-phylloxera vines called Best, and their Meunier is incredible. So good. So New South Wales, I didn't mean to skip over it, a lot of people know it because of the proximity and of course going into Sydney. We spoke about in the beginning of Hunter Valley. So Hunter Valley is Australia's oldest producing wine region, and it's made possible because of winemaking. Otherwise, it would be way too hot, way too rainy, too tropical. But because we harvest the grapes early and before the rain, before it's too hot, that's why we have low alcohol wines. And Semillon, which they used to call Hunter Riesling, arrived in the 1830s. Very grassy and when it's young, but becomes like sesame and rich and buttery and honeyed and toasted with age. And I was saying that I did that tasting of tasting of White Bordeaux, Napa Valley Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and somebody snuck in some old vine Semillon from Hunter. And everyone called it the White Bordeaux because it was with age. When it gets that kind of buttered aroma. So how's yours drinking today, Venkat? Is yours super light and lean? I didn't see the vintage.
Yeah, so it's a 2019 vintage, so very young.
Yes.
It is light and lean, definitely, but I wouldn't actually call it austere.
Well,
It's
2019 is not too young. Let's think about it, right? I mean, it's getting some age, that's for sure.
there is a really, really tiny honey note. Definitely not rich and buttered, but the honey is there. And it's sort of, I'd say, low body, medium plus acid. It's got a really distinct white flower note. More than anything else, that's what I'm picking up.
I love that. The white flowers is definitely there. I found that actually is one of the markers for me for Hunter Valley. The white flowers, like the lilies. Yeah, I mean, I think because it's like has some age is where you're getting that honeyed quality from. It's starting to develop, even though it's, still considered young, but is it in between, right? It's not austere, like you mentioned so perfectly. It's starting to become like secondary and have some texture. They're actually really changed in the bottle, which I'm so shocked about. Okay, well, cool. This is a wine to know from Hunter Valley, Brokenwood. Founded by James Holliday, the wine critic and wine writer. What can I say? They make a old vine graveyard vineyard, which is the first vintage was made in the 80s, in the 83. Old plantings, very, very, very low yield. Like the wine is so concentrated in the fermentation tank because of the skin to juice ratio that the colors are like vivid. I mean, it's like almost as purple as you can imagine a Shiraz to be, but it doesn't taste deep in terms of fruit. It's like they aim for lower alcohol. They just have such low yield. It kind of like tricks you because you look at it and you're like, whoa, that's like, that could paint a wall blue, but then you have it and it's lower in alcohol and has moderate oak, which is why we love it. But that was really fun. And then of course, randomly your Tyrell's wine. So family owned, 1858. They're known for different vineyard sites that are over 100 years old. There's 4 different acres of vineyards that were planted in 1879 and only 1 hectare for Shiraz. And so a little more than, they say like that 1 hectare makes a little more than 1 bottle per year, but I don't even know how that's possible. It's like super low. Basically the point is that it's very, very, very low yielding vines, like almost like doesn't make sense to commercially bottle them. I don't know if they do any more of the Shiraz. And the Semillon, I think you have that one, right? Is that the one? Yeah. So flagship from the best old vine, dry farming, and the oldest of the blocks was 1923. So pretty cool. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about? Oh, this is nice. Because I feel like New South Wales, we don't have that much, like, we love it, but we don't talk too much about, other than Hunter Valley Semillon, I haven't talked too much. So this is a wine that I think everyone should try at some point. Clonakilla, named after the meadow of the church, or Gaelic. It's like an Irish, it was an Irish family that settled in the Canberra district and started making wines in the early 70s or the mid 70s, I guess it's considered. Now it's all Shiraz, but there's a little bit of Viognier in the blend too. It's all Shiraz as far as the red grape, but it's Shiraz Viognier. This tastes like Rhone Valley Côte Rôtie. The winemakers fell in love with a visit in the 90s, started co-fermenting, which was at the time a very rare thing for Australia. They didn't really get why you would co-ferment white grapes with red wine. They thought it would dilute it, but actually the white grapes bind with the color and make the red wine more concentrated in color. And so they discovered that when visiting Côte Rôtie and started doing that. Also aged in French oak, which is rare for these iconic wines from Australia. And last but not least, we'll end where I ended, in Western Australia. This is the largest of all the states on the southwest coast. I really want to spend time talking about Margaret River because this place is so incredibly special. I didn't visit, Swan District. Our group broke up and some people went to the Swan District, but we stayed in Margaret River, thankfully. There's a subregion of Margaret River, which you'll hear everyone talk about, called Williabruck. And it's the heart of Margaret River. That's where like the most famous producers are: Vats Felix, Cullen, Mosswood. And then it's not important, but it's a different subregion where you find Lewin Estate, which is another very famous and important producer, which is located in the subregion of Wallcliffe. I love the Chardonnay. I love the Cabernet. Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, I like them okay. But really this is the move, Cabernet and Chardonnay. And it's one of the few places where Cabernet and Chardonnay grow side by side, right? Because most of the time we see Cabernet growing in warmer climates and Chardonnay in cooler climates. And so the fact that they are both growing together is pretty cool. The wine place that is one of the best wine bars, wine destinations, it's not really a wine bar in the world, is in Margaret River. It's called Settlers Tavern. And Settlers Tavern looks like a pool hall or like a game room. Like they have like, foosball and all the like normal table games. But like the wine list is like that thick, volume 1. And then there's like 3 of them. And God, it was so incredible. Like you saw vintages of like champagne back to the 90s. And like, you're like, I think I'm in like a sports bar. What's happening here? Settlers Tavern. It was one of my favorite places. I had to buy the t-shirt that was Settlers Tavern. But we went all over. I mean, we tasted pretty much every producer of Cabernet because when we got there, there was a Cabernet tasting that was being hosted at Vats Felix, one of my favorite visits. Vats Felix is great if you're like visiting with family. They have a tasting room, they have a restaurant. You can actually go there and like do a tasting and wine pairing experience. And the winemaker is a woman named Virginia Wilcox. She was in, I think, Somme 2. She's just a dynamo. Again, some of the best female winemakers, in the world. And she makes a single vineyard Chardonnay that you would swear, I've served it so many times in my blind tasting, you would swear it was white Burgundy. I mean, it's got minerality and it smells like flinty. She learned the style of which you can make a wine smell more mineral from like producers in Burgundy. But this was founded, the region was intentionally planted in the mid 70s by Dr. Gladstone. Dr. Gladstone really did a soil study and determined that it would be a good place to plant vines. And so it was the latest of all of the states to be planted to vines. And let's talk a little bit about the who's who. Lewin Estate, Trisha and Dennis Hogan purchased this in '69. Robert Mondavi told them about Margaret River and said it would be a great place for Chardonnay. And so they're mostly known in terms of celebration of their art series Chardonnay labels, and really just also very Burgundian in style. They use that gin clone I was telling you about earlier. It's most of Margaret River uses that as well. That hens and chicks, some very concentrated, low yielding vines. And I think that's another reason why they taste so incredibly rich, but still have acidity, which you wouldn't really expect in Australian Shiraz or Chardonnay. Another icon is Cullen Estate. Like I said, they're part of the sub-region of Willabrab. But Dr. John Gladstone, they were doctors in Perth, and they told them about this property that was like an old sheep and cattle ranch. And then they bought it in 71 and started planting 76 and 88 and make an incredible Cab Merlot blend that will taste like Margaux, very floral. And we found like a lot of that violet, but still has that minty quality that you know from Willabrab and from Australia, Margaret River specifically. And then, well, I think I'm partial to loving Bass Felix the most, just because I love Virginia and I love the visit. But this is probably a close second, if not equal. Mosswood, another, you know, like I said, it's kind of like the Hamptons of Perth, right? Lots of doctors retired there, bought properties, second homes. I think we made it from Perth Airport to Margaret River in like 2.5 hours, similar to where you would leave New York City for the weekend and go to Perth. Sorry, go from New York City to the Hamptons, go from Perth to Margaret River. So yeah, they make a really beautiful Cabernet that I think is, it's not Bordeaux-like, it's more, it's definitely Australia, but it has a lot of that gravel soil. You can kind of like always get gravel in Margaret River. I think of all the 40 producers that were at that Cabernet tasting, all of the notes on Willabrab are mint, gravel. So when you get concentration of fruit, when you get mint, and then you also get gravel, because normally gravel and mint are not really that extreme, it has to be Margaret River. That's what we were all talking about during our tastings. Let's see. And that's pretty much our Patreon exclusive wine tasting on Australia. I hopefully didn't run too over time. 1 o'clock, 2:30. Okay, we're good. Any questions, Venkat?
No, I think this was awesome. I guess this is gonna be the last one, but I did really like this.
It's not. It's so Amber and I have a problem because we don't like to charge for anything that we don't feel like is perfect, which is probably our issue. And we're just, you know, we're getting ready to open, we're expanding the Chelsea Market location. We're hoping that we're gonna get this wine license for our wine shop. And we just anticipate that we're gonna be like a little bit busy, and we don't wanna charge for anything that we can't keep up with at the highest level. So we're just gonna do things for free and continue to like promote them to you all. But we just want to say, like, we're not going to charge until we can get our stuff like perfect. So you're going to see like, hey, you're invited to this as a Patreon member. We're just not going to charge until we know that like we're definitely going to have a tip of the day, a Friday post, a wine class every month. Like we're just, yeah. So maybe we have our standards, you know, self-regulating very high, but yeah, it's not going to be the last class, that's for sure.
Got it. That's good. I do really like these. It's sort of like putting meat on the bones to the theory, I think, because there's a lot of great insight that you provide that helps sort of drive home the theory and give additional insight, really. So I really like this. Thank
I'll
you.
come up with my list. Now that I found this, since I was doing my presentation, I'm gonna put all the like fun little things into a list of where to go. Cause like I just found the name of that wine bar in McLaren Vale, that, you know, you just won't find this elsewhere. So I'll put that together when I send out the recap of the video and this presentation.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks for spending the afternoon with me.
Definitely. Thanks, Laura. This was great.
Awesome.
Yeah, and hopefully I'll visit Cork Buzz sometime and check out the new wine shop in Chelsea.
We'll let you know about when we open the expansion and everything.
Definitely.
Okay, have a good one. Bye.
You too. Take care.
Stop recording.